Hello, welcome to a special edition of Pierside here on Sparks 1524. I'm Nathaniel Miller. Got a small confession to make. The first three episodes of Pierside, Underway, Shift Colors, A Rock for the Ages, and Suez, were a stealth trilogy telling the story of my early days aboard USS Ponce, LPD-15. That's a very important time in my life, not just because I was aboard Ponce for only 5 days before we deployed for a 9-month mission. Since I was a little boy, the first thing I ever wanted was to be ship's company aboard a U.S. Navy warship, and I only got that once in my career aboard the Ponce. Every other time I deployed on a U.S. Navy warship, I was simply embarked for the mission. So Ponce holds a special place in my heart for a lot of reasons, and this is one of them. This special edition links those three narratives up into one episode for easy viewing, but it concludes with a special epilogue I filmed to tell you the story of the last time I ever got underway, which was aboard the aircraft carrier USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, CVN-69. I wanted the Ike to be the epilogue because Underway Shift Colors opened with the story of my very first underway in the Navy, which was aboard the carrier Carl Vinson, CVN-70, back in the year 2000. So sit back and enjoy the story of how I went from being the new guy to just one of the guys aboard one of the most remarkable little ships in the Navy, USS Ponce, LPD-15. Getting underway is one of the most dramatic and romantic moments of any ship's journey at sea. When a ship is pierside, the lines are doubled up. This means there are literally 2 lines coming from each mooring point on the ship. Doubling up the lines helps ensure some minor conveniences, such as your ship staying put during heavy weather. Trust me, it's generally considered bad form on the waterfront to allow your ship to go sailing off by itself when inclement weather drops in for a visit. Once the brow is raised prior to getting underway, the command "single up all lines" is given. This command results in 1 line at each point being cast off, and this is the moment when a sailor's heart really begins racing. The next command will be to cast off all lines, and the ship will be floating free. Now, what do we mean by shifting colors? Well, for those of you who have not been in the Navy, we literally shift where we're flying our flags once we're underway. While we're in port, the stern jackstaff has the ensign, the national flag. The bow has the Union Jack, or at certain times the Navy has us fly the Navy Jack. So when we get underway, those flags are lowered and the national ensign is then run up the mast. We literally shift colors as we get underway. The very first time I got underway was October 30th in the year 2000. I was a photographer's mate second class assigned as a reconnaissance camera technician with VF-213 working on F-14D Tomcat fighters. VF-213 and Carrier Air Wing 11 were heading to sea aboard a USS Carl Vinson for TESTA, or Tailored Ship Training Availability. TESTA is the first workup exercise for deployment. It's a bit of a, "Carrier, let me introduce you to the Air Wing. Air Wing, here's your carrier. Shake hands and let's have a good fight." Basically, it's a training cycle where everybody figures out how to play nicely together. I had a small point-and-shoot camera with me at the time, and unfortunately its focus turned out to be ridiculously bad. I only took 3 photos as we shifted colors. Well, I took 2, somebody else took 1. The first 2 I took right at the call of shift colors underway. The third one was taken by one of my buddies of me as the pier began receding. Now later, the next year, when VF-213 and Carrier Air Wing 11 got underway aboard Carl Vinson for the Western Pacific deployment, which we got underway on July 28th of 2001, I wasn't even on the flight deck. This was my first actual deployment, and I watched us get moving from inside the hangar bay because we were still unpacking and sorting tools. Later that morning, I stuck a camera in my tool pouch, one that actually had working focus, and I took a few shots of our guys and our F-14s as the aircraft flew aboard. But otherwise, I kind of missed that big underway moment on my first deployment. I didn't have much to do with the ship. I was a ship writer. My job was working on airplanes. First time I was ship's company was aboard USS Ponce, LPD-15. I reported to Ponce in August of 2010. Now, the ship was not supposed to deploy until October. That's one of the things I liked about reporting to that ship, because I was coming from teaching at the Defense Information School, and I'm about to get on a ship that's going to deploy. Well, great, I've still got a couple of months to move from Fort Meade, Maryland down to Norfolk, get settled, get used to the ship, and get underway. Yeah, it didn't quite happen that way. The Kearsarge Amphibious Ready Group, or ARG, was supposed to have the USS San Antonio, LPD-17. However, the brand new LPD-17 San Antonio broke, and broke hard. So the Ponce was shifted from our original ARG to the Kearsarge ARG, meaning that when I reported aboard on August 21st, I found out that we were deploying for 9 months on August 27th, basically 5 days later. It was a dramatic introduction. I didn't know anything about this ship. I didn't know my way around. I didn't know anybody. I had household goods that were still being unpacked. So it was a very dramatic moment. But now that I'm ship's company, this was also the moment I had to finally get on the deck plate and become part of the operation of a ship. I was determined not to screw it up, even though I felt about as insecure as a deck seaman reporting to the ship right out of boot camp. By the time I reported aboard Ponce, the Navy had merged the 4 media ratings, photographers' mates, journalists, draftsmen, and lithographers' mates, into a new combined Mass Communications Specialist rating, or MC. Smaller decks like Ponce either have 1 MC on the crew or else have 1 deployed aboard for the mission. A ship's company MC like myself should have had a full kit of video gear, lighting, dedicated laptop, still camera equipment, etc. However, because the Proud line was originally due for decommissioning in 2012, I was only able to scare up 1 mid-level SLR camera, 2 lenses, and 1 laptop. This severely limited my photo and video capabilities, but I did what I could. Fortunately for Ponce and the Navy, I'm a clever sort of fellow, so the "I did what I could" was actually quite remarkable, if I do say so myself. Underway Day on August 27, 2010 was a long evolution for me. I was covering events for public release, of course. But I also had to be on deck to create a visual record in case something somewhat unpleasant happened. This meant I worked all morning, all afternoon, and then was up late sorting, captioning, and clearing images for release since Captain Crone had designated me as the public affairs officer. This was a pattern I was to follow the rest of my time on the ship. I never complained about the long hours I worked because the trade-off was that I didn't stand watch underway and my battle station was roaming the entire ship to photograph and document events. Once the family breakfast was done and the families had skedaddled ashore, we set about getting underway. Getting underway is not necessarily a quick process. It can take over an hour. You've got to raise the brows, be it a brow that was attached to the ship by a crane that now has to be lifted and moved, or it could be a brow the ship has. Ponce had a retractable brow that we could fold in on the side, so when we were in ports that didn't have services, we could swing the brow out and drop it and still get on and off our ship. The ship has to be deconnected from all the hotel services. Sewage lines, fresh water lines, shore power, all those have to be disconnected so the ship can run on her own. Kearsarge got underway first, being that she is the senior ship in the Kearsarge ARG. The other ship in our ARG, USS Carter Hall, LSD-50, was actually down at Joint Base Little Creek. That's where she got underway from. So Ponce, we got underway after Kearsarge. I'd been aboard the ship 5 days, 3 of which had been at home unpacking. I didn't really know my way around. I didn't know how to get to the aft line handling rooms yet. Ponce's aft lines are handled from line handling rooms, which are located below the flight deck. They're not in the open air like the forecastle was. I would learn where that was by the end of this day, but at the moment I had to concentrate on what I could see and where I knew to be. I got a great cardio workout as we got underway on August 27th, 2010. Remember, I was the entire media center, so I had to hoof it from the bridge to the bridge wings to the sides of the ship back to the bridge. You get the idea. I stayed off the forecastle itself due to my great personal desire for continued survival. I wasn't worried so much about getting injured, although that was a bit of a concern because I was new to this kind of ship. No, I was more afraid of the deck department sailors deciding a marauding mass communication specialist, whom they didn't yet know from a hole in the deck, would be an impediment to them safely getting on with their work. Rather than risk them giving me a diving lesson from the weather deck of Ponce, I stayed up on the forward superstructure. I'd get familiar with them and the rhythms of the forecastle soon enough, but for the moment, I wanted to stay alive on the first day of deployment. Once Ponce was clear of the pier and in the traffic lanes, we began the whopping 24-hour trip down to Morehead City in North Carolina. We'd pick up our embarked Marines and our embarked landing craft on the 28th, but for the moment we were still transiting out of Chesapeake Bay. Late in the afternoon, we rendezvoused with USNS Leroy Grumman, TAO-195. This was for a replenishment at sea, or RAS. This is one of the Navy's more famous operations where we steam alongside a supply vessel, connect up a high line by shooting lines across to each other, and take on cargo. It's one thing to see this from inside the hangar bay of a carrier, but observing it from Ponce's flight deck was a whole different experience. You really get an idea of the power of the sea just by hearing it crashing between the ships as these seemingly woefully fragile pallets are hauled through midair. It was a very busy day. I finally had dinner around 1800, somewhere up in there, and then, like I said earlier, I was back in my office getting all these photos and what little video I had organized, cataloged, captioned, and then bundling the ones I'm going to release and sending them to the captain just to give him eyes on. We tied up in Morehead City, North Carolina on August 29th in order to embark the Devil Dogs of the 26th Marine Expeditionary Unit and the sailors from 2 Navy Expeditionary Commands. Beachmaster Unit 2's personnel, the go-to experts for establishing and maintaining a logistical beachhead, embarked Ponce with the sailors of Assault Craft Unit 2 aboard the landing craft LCU 1661. An LCU is a landing craft utility. These vessels are the traditional landing craft possessing a shallow draft, enabling them to deploy vehicles and troops onto the beach via a bow ramp. To get the LCU into Ponce's wall deck, we partially sunk the ship. For real. Amphibious assault ships ballast down to decrease buoyancy, much the same way a submarine does. This allows the sea to flood the well deck, enabling small craft to enter and leave the ship. I got to get underway aboard LCU 1661 numerous times during the deployment. I had some truly incredible adventures with those guys, but those are stories for another day. That was a very difficult night, a very difficult day, but also a very exciting one. And it was the beginning of a very remarkable part of my career, one that was as defining for my future as my time in VF 213 was. There is a reason that my first novel, Proud Lion, the first of the Accidental Detective series, was set aboard Ponce. The Rock of Gibraltar is one of the most prominent points of interest in the Mediterranean. About 150 to 200 million years old, it's made up of ancient seabeds that have been compacted together into a titanic monolith. Gibraltar is what's known as an overturned fold. Basically, it's a giant slab of rock that got flipped over on its head by geological forces over millions of years, resulting in the oldest rocks being on top while the youngest are on the bottom. As an ancient piece of an ancient seabed, obviously numerous fossilized remains of animals have been found throughout the rock. Interestingly enough, however, the remains of Neanderthal humans have been found on the rock as well, indicating that this point of land has been colonized by human species for thousands and thousands of years. Gibraltar is connected to the Iberian Peninsula by what's known as a tombolo, which is basically a sandy isthmus. This has made the rock one of the most strategically important points in the Mediterranean for all of human history. Whoever controls the Rock of Gibraltar controls the entrance to the Mediterranean. Gibraltar was known to the ancients as the northern of the two Pillars of Hercules, where mythology states Hercules opened the Mediterranean to the Atlantic Ocean by forcing apart Europe and Africa. The southern pillar's exact identity has been lost to antiquity, unfortunately. Several North African mountains are contenders, but a definitive identity remains elusive. Originally ruled by Spain, the rock was taken by British forces during the War of Spanish Succession in 1704 and formally deeded to Great Britain in 1713. I arrived in Spain to my first command, Fleet Air Reconnaissance Squadron 2, or VQ2, in April of 1998, and I immediately set out getting to know our Morale, Welfare, and Recreation Department on base. MWR provides, among other things, day trips and even overnight trips to various points of interest around wherever the base is, and that goes on here in the States or overseas. My second trip was a day trip down to the Rock of Gibraltar. It was a bus trip from Rota that took a good couple hours, and it was beautiful driving across the southern Spanish countryside of Andalusia. Gibraltar, although physically part of Spain, of the Iberian Peninsula, is controlled by Britain, so we drove up to the border, had to show our passports and everything, and move on through. Much like my first NWR trip to a little town called Ronda in Spain, Gibraltar was a very exciting moment because this is one of those places I'd read about and seen on TV since I was a little boy. And now here I am standing on this rock that, for thousands of years of history in the Mediterranean region, was considered the border to the end of the world. I only had one day in 1998 to visit, so I kind of focused on the British history. But that one day allowed me to see fortifications, structures, and even technology spanning the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. The line wall was constructed in the early 18th century, incorporating numerous older Spanish structures. However, this wall continually evolved, including new weapons and gates, such as the Ragged Staff Gate, which was cut into the wall in 1736 to facilitate easier access to the waterfront. The governor's house was converted from a former convent in 1728. Today, 200 years later, it's still known as the convent and is the residence of the Gibraltar governor. One of the more notable weapons on display is one of the original super guns, the Armstrong 100-ton gun overlooking Nelson Anchorage. With a barrel nearly 33 feet long and weighing in at about 103 tons, the 100-ton gun was a muzzle-loading behemoth. The gun's range was about 6,600 yards, which is roughly 6,000 meters. This meant the 100-ton gun could put a shell through an enemy ship long before that ship itself was in range for its own guns to fire on the rock. I wouldn't get to see the rock again for about 12 years. The next time I got to visit it, well, sort of visit it, I was aboard USS Ponce LPD-15. We went sailing past the rock as we entered the Mediterranean in September of 2010. It was a gorgeous day. It was the kind of day you dream of being at sea. The air was clear, the sky was blue, the sea looked like sapphire beneath us. There wasn't much wind, so the seas were calm. It was a gorgeous day to be up on deck, watching as we passed this while steam in formation with the USS Kearsarge. Navigating the Strait of Gibraltar can be a tricky endeavor because barely 13 miles of water separate Europe and Africa. The sea lanes are usually kind of crowded with shipping. However, fair weather often lends a festive atmosphere to the transit. Sailors in the Mediterranean basin considered the Strait of Gibraltar to be the edge of the world for centuries. Today, the sense of passing through a somewhat mythical gateway remains and continues to thrill mariners and passengers alike. I was still the new guy aboard Ponce at this point. This transit, however, proved to be one of the three pivotal events that established me with my shipmates as truly being one of them. The other two were, of course, my first 48 hours aboard the ship when we got underway in July, and the third event, the final one, was the upcoming transit of the Suez Canal, but I'll tell you more about that one later. Most of my shipmates were unfamiliar with the scope of work expected of Navy mass communications specialists, so they were surprised to find me spending the whole day with them on the bridge and upper superstructure. My primary job was to document events aboard Ponce for public release, but I had two secondary duties charging in hard on the heels of that one. Creating a historical record of events was critical, both simply by orders of Big Davy for, well, historical purposes, but also in case an adverse incident occurred. Should something unwarranted go down, my imagery would be critical to establishing Ponce's role in the affair. This evidence could be what cleared, or potentially convicted, the Navy in such an event, so my place on deck was legally necessary and not just nice for public affairs. Besides getting to interact with my new shipmates, because I'd only been on board Ponce for just a little over a month, this transit let me start getting involved with the embarked Marines for the first time, so I started getting to meet them. But it also resulted in me being granted a very rare privilege. The bridge of a warship is a very tightly controlled space for the obvious reason that a multi-thousand ton warship with lots of things on it that can go boom is being controlled from this space, except for some very senior personnel, both enlisted and officer. Most people who are not actively standing watch on the bridge have to knock and receive permission before they go on the bridge. I'd already received permission to be on the bridge this day because of the transit. I was very careful of my conduct because this is the bridge. Trying to be respectful. One, I'm still the new guy on the ship, so I'm still letting people get used to me, but I also didn't want to be the cause of an incident. Well, apparently I handled myself so well that Captain Crone gave me standing permission to enter and leave the bridge 24/7 anytime I wanted. That's a very rare privilege, especially for someone who never stands watch on the bridge. That privilege, I was very careful to treat with respect, and as a result, it was one I actually got to keep through 4 commanding officers that commanded that ship during the time I was aboard her. My final 2 transits through the Strait of Gibraltar aboard the aircraft carrier USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, CVN-69. I was actually attached to the Navy Public Affairs Support Element East, or NPACE East. NPACE's mission was to put public affairs officers and specialists on deploying ships. Aircraft carriers and the large deck amphibious assault ships have a media center that's about manned up to 50% when the ship is in port. NPACE puts extra sailors into those media centers to bring them up to full strength when the ship deploys. NPACE also exists to put media personnel on the smaller ships that don't have dedicated media centers or permanently assigned personnel. I was leading the SEOP detachment from NPACE East aboard the Ike. At this point in my career, I'm still a first-class petty officer, but I am the guy in charge. I'm in charge of this debt, and I'm assisting the media center leading petty officer as I was basically her assistant LPO for the entire shebang aboard Ike. When we went through the Strait of Gibraltar in July of 2012, I wasn't even on the deck. I didn't get to see it because I had work down below. One of my sailors, MC2 Aaron Chase, was deployed aboard one of Ike's strike group. Getting those photos from Aaron was quite an experience. I mean, seeing my own ship from another deck wasn't exactly new for me, but until now, whenever I'd seen my own ship from another ship, I'd been the one doing the photography. This was odd, getting photos from someone else. However, I was the detachment leading petty officer, meaning it was my sailors' turn to hit the deck plate shooting the jobs and my turn to mentor them and get their imagery up to the chief. While I was aboard Ike, I did get out and shoot a job at least once a month or so to keep my own technical skills sharp and to keep my credibility up with with my junior sailors so they would believe me when I would give them constructive criticism and feedback. But most of the time, I wasn't there. I did, however, make it a point to be on the flight deck as we transited back on our way home in December. The day was clear, but somewhat cold with a biting wind made all the stronger as the air currents zipped between the headlands of the strait. Due to the need for care when transiting such a narrow strait, Ike was on a no-fly day, meaning the flight deck was open to all. You just had to watch your head because turning around and cracking your cranium on the wing of a parked airplane does rather smart. Not that I did it that day, but I am speaking from previously painful experience. For me, though, there was an odd air of finality seeing Gibraltar sliding across the horizon north of the ship. I was about to transfer to shore duty, and I was already beginning to wonder if I should start considering retirement. I'd gotten pretty banged up over the years, and steel decks aren't the best thing for permanently injured feet and knees. I'm not being dramatic when I say I had a foreboding premonition I'd not see the Rock again while I was on active duty. This premonition was reinforced in 2017 by the retirement of a ship I'd never served aboard, USS Enterprise, CVN-65. In an ironic twist of circumstances, I'd never gotten orders to the Big E despite trying for 20 years. However, every time I deployed, the ship I was on did a formal photo formation with Enterprise. Ike's formal photo shoot with the older carrier was a big deal in 2012 because Enterprise was on her final deployment. 4 months later in December, I'm on the flight deck watching Gibraltar as Ike heads home. I was joking with some of the buddies I'd made during deployment about Enterprise's impending retirement, my own odd history of always sailing in formation with her, and the distinct feeling I had I'd not see Gibraltar again as a Navy sailor. One of the guys remarked that I'd better stop talking about it because either I was psychic and saw the future, or else I'd jinx myself as surely as if I killed an albatross. Well, that is how things worked out. My retirement after Enterprises, I mean, not the albatross thing. There are some things a sailor just does not do, and killing an albatross is top of that list. Anyway, at this point in December of 2012, that was all in the future. Whatever my own odd feelings were, we had a glorious day to sail past the Rock, a day that echoed the magnificent skies and seas Ponce enjoyed the first time I sailed past Gibraltar back in 2010. One of the more rare cloud formations you can see over mountains are called lenticular clouds. These clouds frankly look like giant lenses hovering over the mountains. In fact, lenticular clouds have even been mistaken for flying saucer due to their nearly perfect symmetry and tendency to glow slightly as they catch the sidelight from the sun when it's low in the sky. These incredible formations result from atmospheric moisture condensing as the wind crests the summit or ridge before falling into the trough on the leeward side. The lenticular cloud we saw over Gibraltar this day really seemed like an early Christmas gift as we headed home. I appreciate your time and I appreciate you coming along with me on this voyage to Gibraltar and the waters it guards. To stand on the rock or to sail past it is to cross a gateway, a threshold to ancient lands of great adventure. If you're ever in southern Spain, Gibraltar itself is worth a visit, and not just for the military history or geological history. The Gibraltar culture is an interesting amalgamation of British, Spanish, and other nationalities who formed a very unique society on that peninsula.
Very easy passage. It's the culmination of the transatlantic voyage for us, and like the transit across, it was a nice, smooth operation. Initially concerned about the weather and the hurricanes that were out in the ocean. However, we found a groove in between the two, and were able to successfully make the transatlantic crossing without any difficulty, and a lot of good training conducted in the process.
Informally known as the Ditch, the Suez Canal is one of the most vital links in the world's shipping. This one canal allows vessels to shave multiple days, sometimes even weeks, as well as thousands of miles off their journeys. Transiting the canal is not just to see a magnificent engineering marvel, but it's also to pass through ancient lands that have affected and influenced cultures around the world. Passing through the Suez Canal is always an event, especially when it's your first time. I joined the Navy on September 16th, 1997, because I wanted to serve the nation. I wanted to have the adventure of being in the Navy, and I wanted to see the world. It's like the old recruiting poster back in the day: join the Navy, see the world. My first deployment was a Westpac, or Western Pacific deployment. And Westpac 0102 took me from San Diego across the Pacific into the Arabian Sea. And then we turned around and came back. So for Westpac 2001, 2002, I went halfway around the world, literally halfway, and then came home. It would be about another 10 years before I finally completed circumnavigating the globe, only I would finish it not by going in a full circle. I would go the opposite way and meet in the middle where I had stopped 10 years before. So I have been literally around the world. I just did this and then this. And that this is part of the story of where I got to sail through the Suez Canal. I reported aboard the amphibious transport dock USS Ponce, LPD-15, in July of 2010, just about 5 days before a 9-month deployment. I was the new guy. There were 3 events the early part of that deployment that really kind of welded me into the crew, if you will. The first was the work that my shipmates saw me doing as we got underway to start that deployment. That day was literally the first day most of them even knew I was on board. The second big event in which I was able to build my credibility was our passage through the Strait of Gibraltar. The third event, and the final one that really broke down all the final barriers between me and my shipmates, was our passage through the Suez Canal. Most of the reticence to work with me and kind of let me in, if you will, stemmed from a lack of experience with mass communication specialists and the scope of work that we do. Let's be honest, if you're working in the engine room and you're sweaty and dirty and some guy with a camera in a generally neat uniform comes down, your first thought, if you don't actually know him, is that, great, another one of those nerds with a camera going to take a few pictures and run back up to the air conditioning. If you're on the forecastle as part of the deck department, you're covered in grease and grime, you've been needle gunning rust all day, you're painting. Here comes this guy out of the air-conditioned spaces of the ship, camera in hand, bright and chipper expression. Same thing. Great. Camera nerd. Terrific. I was determined to overcome that, and I started that when we went underway, and I continued that work ethic going past the Strait of Gibraltar. But it was the Suez Canal, when I showed up on the forecastle at 03:30 in the morning, that was the final piece to the puzzle. This was the event that showed them I am a sailor. I'm going to get up and I'm going to do the long hours, and I'll be on deck with them because I'm part of them. This is my ship. I'm going to support it. What made it even cooler was that this final piece of the puzzle, to me, truly becoming part of the crew of Ponce, coincided with yet another childhood dream: sailing through the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was not a new idea. The ancient Egyptians dug canals to create waterways and facilitate trade around the area. The effort to build a modern maritime highway began in 1830, but the canal would take nearly 40 years to complete. Opening in 1869, the Suez Canal stretches for 120 miles, about 193 kilometers, and remains a vital link between the Mediterranean and the Red Seas. Originally a one-lane highway, convoys would have to anchor in the Great Bitter Lake to allow convoys heading the opposite direction to pass. Egypt significantly expanded the canal in 2015 by creating a partial second lane. This helped speed north and southbound convoys, decreasing transit time by up to 18 hours. The Suez Canal is an engineering masterpiece located in a somewhat volatile part of the world. To protect the traffic flow, the Egyptian government maintains a tight cordon of security around the canal, so guard posts and military patrols are a regular part of the landscape. Ships gather into convoys, with the southbound convoys starting the transit about half an hour before northbound convoys get underway. To make the transit safely, ships take on a pilot. Sailing through a narrow waterway isn't just a matter of keeping your rudder straight. Wind loading can push a vessel off course, and the bigger the ship with more surface area for the wind to hit, the greater the effect the wind has. Additionally, the water flowing between the ship's hull and the canal banks has to flow faster than the water ahead of or behind the ship. This results in less water pressure between the ship and canal walls. If a ship gets off course, this bank effect can literally suck a ship into the canal banks, grounding it hard. These two factors caused the grounding of the massive MV Ever Given in 2021, blocking the canal for 6 days because the ship got stuck south of the new two-lane sections. The canal bristles with aids to navigation, providing transiting ships with everything from range points to day marks in order to accident-proof their travel as much as possible, and canal pilots are a key part of this. However, the ship's captain is ultimately responsible for the safety of their vessel, but the pilots provide a wealth of knowledge and experience for the captain to rely on. Now, ships anchor in the Great Bitter Lake to allow other convoys to pass. It's a very tightly orchestrated traffic flow through the canal. Depending on the time of year, anchoring in the Great Bitter Lake can be a scorching experience or a freezing experience. When we went through in September of 2010, it was the scorching variety. I was on deck since 0330. Yes, public affairs are important, but also, as I've said before on this channel, if something went wrong, something happened, I had to create a visual record. So I was up there all day, but let's be honest. Yes, I'm up all day and I'm running around a ship in the Middle East, but I'm the lucky one. I get to go back inside if I want. I can duck into the bridge and cool down. If there were any real heroes aboard Ponce while transiting the canal, it's the deck and security forces standing in the sun all day watching our backs, and the snipes broiling in the engineering spaces below, ensuring the Proud Lion maintained power and maneuverability. The first major landmark the Proud Lion saw as dawn approached was the Suez Canal Bridge, also known as the Friendship Bridge. Built with the assistance of the Japanese government in 1995, the bridge links mainland Egypt to the Sinai Peninsula. However, the bridge also quite literally links two continents, Africa and Asia. A little further down, the El Ferndon Railway Bridge dates back to 1918, with the current structure having been completed in 2001. A swing-span bridge, the two halves of the crossing provide yet another dramatic point breaking the monotony of the desert horizon. One of the more impressive sights is the 1918 Suez Canal Defense Monument. This structure, built with twin obelisks, was erected to commemorate the successful defense of the Suez from the Ottoman Empire during World War I. It's probably one of the most photographed sites along the canal, not the least of which is because of its dramatic rise from the desert sand into the sky. The Proud Lion transited back north through the canal on March 2nd, 2011. This was a very different day. This was not the scorcher, this was more of the chiller, if you will. Being March, it was a lot cooler. Actually, in fact, in the early morning hours, it was downright cold. But as the sun came up and the day and the daylight hours took over, the air was much more mild. Because it was so much cooler, there wasn't nearly as much haze in the air. So this time the colors around us really popped. The other ships around us were almost gay in their colors, including this one cruise ship that was pretty neat to look at. The colors of the monuments along the canal just were so much more vibrant. It was a gorgeous day. Now, if you think that going through the canal on a smaller ship like the USS Ponce makes the canal feel narrow, try going through it on an aircraft carrier. Aboard a ship like the Ponce, you stand in the center line of the ship on the forecastle and look either way. You see water, and then you see the banks. You stand on the center line of an aircraft carrier transiting the canal. You look on either side of the flight deck, and you don't see no water. You just see flight deck and land. My last two transits were aboard the aircraft carrier USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, CVN-69. Now, I wasn't attached to the ship, I was attached to the Navy Public Affairs Support Element East, or NPACE East. NPACE puts sailors, media sailors, mass communication specialists, and public affairs officers on the large decks, like carriers and large deck amphibious assault ships, to bring their media centers up to full strength during deployment. NPACE also puts MCs, mass communication specialists, on the smaller decks to give them a public affairs presence during deployment. So my last two transits through the canal, I was the leading petty officer of NPACE East Detachment, or DET, aboard the Ike. This time around, it was my junior sailor's turn to do all the cool footage. That means, however, that all the footage I took this time through these two transits belonged to me. I was just one of the tourists up on the deck as we transited through. Ike's passage south was on July 18th, 2012. The day started out way foggy. The Friendship Bridge loomed over us like a ghost, pretty much appearing at the last minute. The day did clear later on, however, allowing us to enjoy the sights on our way down to the Red Sea. I did spend time on the deck coaching my sailors, but I have to admit most of my time on deck this time around was simply getting a chance to look around and enjoy the view. Ike and her strike group transited back north through the canal on December 1st of 2012. On Ponce, when we transited north, we were on the tail end of our deployment, but we still had a little bit to go. When I transited through on the Ike, we were leaving our deployment. We transited through the canal, shot straight through the Mediterranean, through the Straits of Gibraltar, across the Atlantic, back home. So this transit north marked effectively the end of the operational part of the deployment, and therefore there was a very festive air aboard ship as we went north. We were going home. It was an early Christmas present. Of course, we were also enjoying the fact it was rather warm, because in just a couple of weeks we were going to be in Virginia in December. One thing that really struck me about transiting the canal on the Ike is just the unreality of watching things move past you. When you transit through the canal on a smaller ship like Ponce, there is a sense of you doing the moving. You can see the water on either side of the hull. You can see the canal banks. You have a sense that your ship is the one moving. You transit through a canal like that on an aircraft carrier, a ship of that kind of size, there is a very unreal feeling that you're standing still and the entire world is moving around you. The Friendship Bridge, for example, there is no sensation that the Ike was moving as we passed under the Friendship Bridge, either going or coming. It looks like this giant bridge is moving and we're standing still. It was the oddest feeling. But it was a good feeling, especially since we were going home. Passing through the Suez Canal was a dream come true for me. There is an unofficial society in the Navy called the Order of the Ditch. It's those of us who transited the Suez Canal. The Ponce didn't give out certificates or anything when we went through, but the Ike did. And I've got mine framed on the wall. I just put a little notation on it to note that my first transit was actually back in 2010 aboard Ponce, but I still have it proudly on the wall next to my shellback certificate from 2002. Passing through the Suez wasn't just a childhood dream come true, however. It was the final moment in which I earned my credibility with my shipmates aboard Ponce. Prior to the Suez, most of them were still meeting me, and most of them were surprised to see me on deck when something went down, much less on deck with them all day during the event. After our first transit through the Suez, the only thing that would surprise my shipmates is if I didn't show up. I actually ended up earning a second nickname aboard Ponce. I'd been Sparky Miller for years, and that's a story I'll tell you later. But I was seen around that ship with that camera so much my shipmates started calling me MC1 Paparazzi. The captain would sometimes have me paged over the 1MC, MC1 paparazzi, report to the bridge. Through the Suez on the Ike wasn't quite as emotional because I didn't have the same stakes involved, and that time I was not the one taking the photos and video for release. I was there mentoring my junior sailors. But that in itself was pretty rewarding. The USS Dwight D. Eisenhower Strike Group deployed on June 20th, 2012. One thing I got lucky on in my career was good weather on every deployment day I had. June 20th was sunny, but with a bit of haze in the sky. In other words, a typical summer day in Virginia. The vibe on the flight deck changes once sailors on the pier start bringing the ship's stanchions and other equipment back on board. This is the first part of the complex dance that is getting an aircraft carrier out to sea. Things get serious once the ship is uncoupled from the hotel services and the brow is raised and moved out of the way. On a standard surface ship, this is usually followed by singling up the lines. A carrier, however, has to raise its elevators back to the flight deck before the lines can be handled. A carrier's line handling rooms are enclosed down under the flight deck, so there's not the same level of visual drama seeing the lines singled up. Navy ships dress to impress when deploying. Sailors and embarked personnel not standing watch or otherwise performing required duties man the rails in our dress uniforms. This results in a patriotically festive air mixing with a moment that is pretty emotional for everyone, be they on the ship or on the pier. Whether you're leaving a family and children on shore, or you're a single sailor, there's still a lump of emotion that hits when you see the pier begin to fall away. As the Ike approached the headlands, which would transfer her from the James River into Chesapeake Bay, I had head down below. The ship's senior media LPO needed my help as we began to sort through all the imagery that had been shot that day so far. At the moment, we mainly were concentrating on the still imagery, but eventually we'd have to get to the video as well, and there was a lot we needed to get done because imagery has to get out as fast as possible, otherwise the news cycle moves on and forgets about you. Our sailors overhead in the helo kept up their coverage until Ike was safely in Chesapeake Bay's deeper waters. But they still got their footage to us early enough that we could select the best material and get it to the ship's public affairs officer. She then gave her stamp of approval, releasing the photos and video to the world. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. I've definitely enjoyed being able to tell these stories. Please hit that like button and feel free to share this if you want to. If you're interested in what I do here, hit that subscribe button. I'll see you next time, and until we meet here again, have a great Navy day. Go do some great things.
Hello, welcome to the Ponce Report. Boy, that's the line report. In addition to taking on food, fuel, and other needed supplies and parts, the Proud Line received thousands of pounds of mail. Now, as welcome as this is to any sailor who's been at sea for a while, the Proud Line received thousands of pounds of mail. Now, as welcome as such... Although the proud lions on board USS Ponce would much rather be home with their friends and families for the holidays, they have nonetheless started out the season in style. For the Ponce Report, I just did it again. Hamsters in a foot. Hamsters in a foot. Hello, welcome to the Lions Report. I'm Navy Petty Officer Nathaniel Miller. That's probably why you shouldn't drink a Diet Coke right before going on camera.